The fog rolled in from the North Sea just after dawn on September 3, 1942, thick and gray like wool pulled over the eyes of Dover. Margaret Ashford stood at the harbor's edge, her worn coat wrapped tight against the cold, watching the water swallow the last of the fishing fleet. 7 boats. She counted them twice, her lips moving silently, committing each vessel to memory the way she'd done every morning for the past 3 years. Her father's boat, the Mary Catherine, named for her mother who died bringing Margaret into this world, was third in line. She could just make out his silhouette at the helm, one hand raised in farewell. Margaret lifted her own hand, holding it there until the fog took him completely. She didn't know then that this would be the last time she'd see him alive. None of them knew. The harbor smelled of salt and diesel fuel, fish and hope. It smelled like every morning of Margaret's 22 years, except now it also smelled of war. The smell clung to everything, to the sandbags stacked against the harbor master's office, to the anti-aircraft guns positioned on the cliffs above, to the very air they breathed. The war had a smell, and once you knew it, you could never forget it. She turned to walk back up the cobblestone street toward the bakery where she worked, her shoes clicking against stones worn smooth by generations of fishermen's wives and daughters. The sound echoed in the emptiness. Dover had changed. Half the town had evacuated after Dunkirk, sent inland to safety, but Margaret had refused to go. How could she leave? Who would watch for the boats? Inside the bakery, Mrs. Pemberton was already elbow-deep in dough, her thick arms working the mixture with the same rhythm she'd maintained for 40 years. The wireless sat on the shelf above the counter, crackling with news from London. The BBC announcer's voice was steady, trained to deliver horror in measured tones. Another convoy attacked in the Atlantic. 50 ships lost. The numbers had stopped meaning anything months ago. They were just numbers until they became names. Until they became your father, your brother, your husband. "Your dog get off all right then?" Mrs. Pemberton asked without looking up. "Yes, ma'am." They all did. "Good. That's good." But her voice carried no conviction. Nothing was good anymore. Good was a word from before, from when the worst thing that could happen was a poor catch or a storm that kept the boats in harbor for a few days. Margaret tied on her apron and began shaping rolls, her hands moving automatically while her mind stayed at the harbor. The fishing fleet wasn't supposed to be out there, not really. The Navy had restricted most of the channel, declared it too dangerous for civilian vessels. But people still needed to eat, and fish were one of the few foods not rationed into near extinction. So the fishermen went out, navigating between minefields and U-boat hunting grounds, hoping their small boats were too insignificant for the war to notice. They were wrong. The first explosion came at 10:30. Margaret heard it through the bakery walls. A deep, resonant boom that rattled the windows and sent a bag of flour tumbling from its shelf. She and Mrs. Pemberton locked eyes for a single, frozen moment before Margaret tore off her apron and ran. The street was already filling with people, all of them running toward the harbor, all of them wearing the same expression of controlled terror that came from months of practicing what to do when the worst happened. Margaret pushed through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. Not the boats. Please, God, not the boats. At the harbor's edge, she could see the smoke, black and oily, rising from somewhere out in the fog. The harbor master was on his radio, shouting coordinates she didn't understand. 2 women beside her were crying. Margaret realized one of them was her neighbor, Emma Whitmore, whose husband captained the Resolute. What happened? Margaret grabbed Emma's arm. "What did you hear?" Emma's face was white. "Mine. They hit a mine." The fog was lifting now, burned away by the morning sun, and Margaret could see them. The fishing boats, scattered across the water like toys in a bathtub. She counted frantically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 boats. One was missing. The Mary Catherine didn't come home that night. Neither did the Resolute or the crew of the Dover Belle, which had gone to help after the explosion and caught the full force of a second mine that no one had known was there. 17 men went out that morning. 8 came back, and 2 of those would die from their injuries before the week was out. Margaret didn't leave the harbor. She stood at the same spot where she'd watched them leave, as if staying there might somehow pull her father back across the water. Other women joined her. Emma Whitmore, who sat on the cold stone with her knees drawn up to her chest, and old Mrs. Fletcher, whose son and grandson had both been on the Dover Belle. They didn't speak much. There wasn't anything to say that hadn't already been said 1,000 times in 1,000 harbors across England. The rescue boats went out at first light the next morning. Margaret watched them cut through the calm water, hope and dread twisting together in her stomach. She'd barely slept, had refused to go home even when Mrs. Pemberton brought her a blanket and a thermos of tea. The September night had been cold, but Margaret barely felt it. All she could feel was the weight of waiting. When the rescue boats returned, they brought wreckage. Planks from the Mary Catherine, scorched and splintered. A fishing net tangled with seaweed. One of her father's boots still tied. The harbor master, a gruff man named Davies, who'd sailed with her father for 20 years, placed the boot in her hands without meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry, Margaret. We'll keep looking," but he didn't finish. They both knew what the cold water meant, what the hours meant. Margaret clutched the boot to her chest and finally let herself cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears she'd been taught were proper, but great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Emma put an arm around her shoulders, and they cried together, two women among thousands who were learning the same lesson. War didn't just kill soldiers. It killed fishermen and bakers, teachers and shopkeepers. It killed fathers. The official telegram came 3 days later. Missing, presumed dead. The words were typed on thin paper that felt like nothing in her hands, as insubstantial as the hope she'd been clinging to. The government would send a pension, the letter said. 13 shillings a week. That was what her father's life was worth to the British Empire. Margaret burned the letter in the bakery oven and went back to the harbor. She went every morning before work and every evening after, standing at the water's edge and watching. Waiting. She knew it was foolish. The rescue operations had ended after a week, and the Navy had declared the area too dangerous for further searches. But she couldn't stop. What if he was out there somewhere, clinging to debris, waiting for someone to find him? What if they'd all given up too soon? Mrs. Pemberton didn't tell her to stop, though Margaret saw the worry in her eyes. Instead, she adjusted Margaret's schedule, let her start work late and leave early. The bakery became a refuge, the only place where Margaret's hands knew what to do even when her mind had forgotten. Knead the dough, shape the rolls, tend the oven. Simple tasks that had been done the same way for centuries. Tasks that would continue long after this war became just another chapter in the history books. But the harbor haunted her. She began to dream about it. Dark water and empty horizon, the sound of waves against stone, her father's voice calling to her from somewhere she could never quite reach. She'd wake gasping, her pillow damp with tears, and lie in the darkness of her childhood bedroom, listening to the silence where her father's snoring used to rumble through the walls. The town treated her with careful kindness, the way people do when they're afraid grief might be contagious. They pressed her hand and murmured condolences, brought casseroles she couldn't eat, and avoided looking at her too directly, as if the depth of her loss might pull them under too. Only Emma understood. They formed an unspoken alliance, two women bound by the same empty place at their dinner tables. 3 weeks after the explosion, Margaret returned home from the harbor to find her father's chair exactly as he'd left it, his pipe still resting in the ashtray, his reading glasses folded on top of yesterday's newspaper. She'd been avoiding this room, this confrontation with his absence. Now she stood in the doorway and let herself really see it. The life interrupted, the ordinary moments that would never be resumed. She picked up the glasses and held them to the light. The lenses were smudged with his fingerprints. She could clean them, put them away in a drawer with his other belongings, begin the process of packing up his life, or she could leave them here, maintain the fiction that he might walk through the door at any moment, looking for his glasses and his pipe and the evening paper. Margaret set them back down exactly where they'd been and returned to the harbor. November came with rain that turned the harbor to gray on gray, sea and sky merging until Margaret could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. She'd been standing watch for 2 months now, and the town had stopped treating her grief as temporary. She saw it in their faces, the way their expressions shifted from sympathy to concern, to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "You need to stop this. Love," Mrs. Pemberton said one morning, her voice gentle but firm. "It's not healthy, standing out there in all weather. You'll catch your death." Margaret tied her apron with steady hands. He could still come back. You read about it. People surviving impossible things. That pilot who floated for 3 weeks in the Pacific. The merchant sailors who... Margaret. Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut through her desperate litany. Those men were found within days. It's been 2 months. The cold water alone. She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm saying this because I care about you. Because your mum was my dearest friend. And she'd want someone to look after you. This isn't grief anymore. It's something else." But Margaret couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Because stopping meant accepting, and accepting meant her father was truly gone. As long as she kept watching, kept waiting, there was still a thread of possibility, thin as spider silk but unbroken. She clung to it with the desperation of someone who has nothing left to hold. The war ground on around her. indifferent to her private tragedy. The newspapers were full of bigger losses. Stalingrad, North Africa, the continued bombing of London. Thousands dead, tens of thousands. What was one fisherman weighed against that? What were 17 men from Dover in the vast calculus of total war? Everything, Margaret thought. They were everything. Emma Whitmore stopped coming to the harbor in December. Margaret found her at home one afternoon, packing away her husband's clothes, her movements mechanical and necessary. "I have to move forward," Emma said, not meeting Margaret's eyes. "The Navy's offered me a position at the communications center. The money's better than the pension, and I need something to do. Something that isn't this." She gestured vaguely at the boxes, at her wedding photo on the mantel, at the whole suffocating weight of absence. "I understand," Margaret said. Though she couldn't, do you? Emma turned to face her, and there was something sharp in her expression. "Because from where I'm standing, you're drowning, Margaret. You're standing at that harbor like it's quicksand, and you're sinking deeper every day, and you won't let anyone pull you out. He might come back. He won't." The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. "I'm sorry, but he won't. And you're wasting your life waiting for a miracle that isn't coming." Margaret left without another word. She walked through the cold December rain back to the harbor, back to her spot at the water's edge, and stood there as darkness fell and the temperature dropped and ice began to form at the tide line. She stood there until Mrs. Pemberton came and physically led her home, wrapped her in blankets, and sat with her while she shivered and wept. The nightmares got worse. She dreamed of her father drowning, his hands reaching up through black water. She dreamed of him calling her name, his voice growing fainter with each repetition. She dreamed of him angry, demanding to know why she hadn't saved him, why she hadn't done something, anything. She woke gasping and crying and couldn't remember how to breathe properly, how to exist in a world that kept spinning when it should have stopped, should have marked the moment of his death with something more than just another sunrise over an empty harbor. Christmas came. The bakery was busy despite rationing. People desperate for small pieces of normalcy, for traditions that connected them to the time before. Margaret made mince pies with mock mincemeat, sugarless cakes, bread stretched thin with potato. Her hands worked while her mind stayed at the harbor, counting boats that weren't there. On Christmas Eve, she stood in the cold and sang her father's favorite carol, "O Holy Night," her voice thin and wavering in the darkness. A few people passing by stopped to listen, and when she finished, she heard someone crying. She turned to find Mrs. Fletcher, who'd lost her son and grandson, standing a few feet away. "I come here sometimes too," the old woman admitted. "I know they're gone, I do, but I can't seem to stay away." They stood together in silence, two ghosts haunting a harbor that held nothing but memories and salt water. And Margaret realized, with a clarity that felt like breaking glass, that Emma was right. She was drowning, but she didn't know how to stop. The storm hit Dover on January 15th, 1943, with winds that bent trees horizontal and waves that crashed over the harbor wall, sending spray 30 feet into the air. The wireless warned everyone to stay inside, to secure anything that could become a projectile, to prepare for flooding in low-lying areas. Margaret heard none of it. She was already at the harbor. The wind tore at her coat, tried to push her back, but she leaned into it, driven by something beyond logic. In the chaos of the storm, she felt closer to her father than she had in months. This was the violence he'd faced. Water and wind and the indifferent fury of nature. If she could stand in it, endure it, maybe she could understand what his last moments had been like. "Margaret!" Someone was shouting her name, but the wind snatched the sound away. A hand grabbed her arm, and she turned to find Davies, the harbor master, his face red with cold and effort. "Are you mad? Get away from the edge." "I have to watch," she screamed back. "What if he comes back? What if he finally—" A wave crashed over the wall, drenching them both in freezing water. Davies dragged her backward, his grip iron hard, and she fought him with a strength born of months of accumulated desperation. They struggled at the edge of the harbor, two figures barely visible through the sheets of rain. And then Margaret's foot slipped on the wet stone. She fell hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was lie there on the cold, wet stone while rain hammered down on her face, and the wind screamed like all the souls the sea had ever taken. Davies pulled her up, and this time she didn't resist. He half carried, half dragged her to the harbor master's office, shoved her inside and slammed the door against the wind. The sudden quiet was shocking. "Sit," he ordered, pointing at a chair. Margaret sat, shivering violently, water pooling around her feet. Davies disappeared into a back room and returned with a blanket and a mug of something that burned going down. Whiskey, probably from the bottle he kept for emergencies. Right then, he said, sitting down across from her. Let's talk about your father. Margaret's head snapped up. Don't. We sailed together for 20 years, Margaret. I knew him better than most. And I'll tell you what he'd say if he could see you now. Davies leaned forward, his weathered face serious. He'd be furious. The words hit like a slap. How dare you? He'd be furious, Davies continued, his voice rough but not unkind. Because you're killing yourself waiting for him. Because you've stopped living. Because you're so determined to hold on to him that you've let go of everything else. Your health, your friends, your future. And William Ashford loved you more than life itself, girl. The last thing he'd want is for you to throw your life away on his account. Tears were streaming down Margaret's face, hot against her cold skin. I don't know how to let him go. I don't either, Davies admitted. Lost my brother at Jutland in the last war. Kept expecting him to walk through the door for years afterward. But eventually I had to accept that waiting wasn't the same as honoring. And your father deserves to be honored, Margaret. Not mourned into your own grave. They sat in silence while the storm raged outside. Margaret wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to breathe around the tightness in her chest. In her mind, she saw her father at the helm of the Mary Catherine, saw him raising his hand in farewell, saw him disappearing into the fog. She'd been trying so hard to hold on to that image, to keep him frozen in that final moment, that she'd forgotten all the other moments, the thousands of ordinary days that had made up their life together. Tell me about him, she said quietly. Tell me something I don't know. Davies smiled, and for the first time in months, Margaret saw genuine warmth in someone's expression when they looked at her. Did you know he couldn't swim? Margaret blinked. What? Couldn't swim a stroke. Terrified of the water, actually, when he was young. But he loved the sea, loved fishing, and he wasn't about to let fear stop him from doing what he loved. So every day he went out on that boat, he was choosing courage over fear. Davies paused. That's what he'd want you to do now. Choose courage. The storm lasted through the night. Margaret slept fitfully in the harbor master's office, wrapped in borrowed blankets, while Davies kept watch. When she woke just after dawn, the wind had died and the rain had stopped. Through the window she could see the harbor, battered but intact, water still choppy but no longer murderous. She walked to the door and looked out at the familiar view. The empty harbor, the gray water, the horizon where 7 boats had disappeared and 6 had returned. She'd stood here so many times, waiting for something that would never come, that she'd stopped seeing what was actually there. The continuation of life, the resilience of the town, the slow, painful process of healing. He's not coming back, she said aloud, and the words didn't destroy her the way she'd feared they would. They hurt. God, they hurt. But they also felt like truth, and truth, even painful truth, had a kind of power to it. Davies came to stand beside her. No, he's not. Margaret took a deep breath of salt air and felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, not yet, but the first small movement toward it. I should go home. Mrs. Pemberton will be worried. She's been worried for months, Davies said gently, but she'll be glad to see you coming to your senses. Margaret turned to leave, then stopped. Davies, thank you. For last night. For not letting me. Your father would have done the same for me, he said simply. That's what we do. We look after each other. Spring came to Dover slowly, as if nature itself was being cautious, testing whether the world was ready for beauty again. Margaret noticed it first in the bakery, the way the early morning light through the windows shifted from gray to gold, the way the air coming in through the door had lost its winter bite. She'd stopped going to the harbor every day. Some days she didn't go at all, and the guilt she'd expected to feel about that absence never came. Instead, she felt something lighter, something that might have been relief. She'd started volunteering at the communications center where Emma worked, transcribing messages, sorting intelligence reports, doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept the war machine running. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary, and necessity had its own kind of meaning. She and Emma had repaired their friendship, learning to talk about their losses without drowning in them, learning that remembering didn't require constant mourning. On a morning in late April, Margaret found herself at the harbor again, but this time it felt different. She wasn't waiting. She was just there. The fishing fleet, rebuilt and reorganized with new captains and new boats, was preparing to launch. She counted 6 vessels, all of them bearing the scars of wartime service, but still seaworthy, still determined, mourning Margaret. Davies had come to stand beside her, his presence comfortable and undemanding. Good to see you here. I'm not watching the way I used to, she said, needing him to understand. I know, You're saying hello. There's a difference. He nodded toward the boats. Young Fletcher's taking out the new Dawn today. First time captaining. Mrs. Fletcher's grandson, Margaret realized. The one who'd been too young to sail the day the mines took his father and older brother. He'd be 19 now, old enough for the Navy but given a fisherman's exemption because Dover still needed to eat. And the war machine needed men who could navigate dangerous waters. He's terrified, Davies continued. But he's going anyway. Bravest thing I've seen in years. They watched the boats depart, the same ritual that had played out in this harbor for centuries. Women and men on the shore, waving goodbye. Sailors on the decks, waving back. The eternal uncertainty of the sea meeting the stubborn persistence of those who made their living from it. But this time, when the boats disappeared beyond the harbor mouth, Margaret didn't stay. She had work to do, messages to transcribe, a life to live. She turned away from the water and walked up the cobblestone street, her footsteps echoing the same way they always had. At the bakery, Mrs. Pemberton looked up from her dough and smiled. A real smile, full of warmth and approval. Kettle's on. Thought you might want tea. Thank you. Margaret tied on her apron and began working, her hands moving through familiar motions. Outside, the world was at war. Men were dying in North Africa and the Pacific, in the skies over Germany and the waters of the Atlantic. But here, in this small bakery in Dover, there was bread to make and people to feed, and the simple, stubborn continuity of ordinary life. That evening, Margaret went home to the house that no longer felt haunted. She'd packed away most of her father's things, kept only what mattered, his pipe, his reading glasses, a photo of him at the helm of the Mary Catherine. The rest she'd donated to the war effort, or given to men in the fleet who could use them. The house felt different now, lighter, not empty but waiting to be filled with whatever came next. She made herself dinner, precious little of it, stretched thin by rationing, and sat at the kitchen table with her father's newspaper, now months out of date. She'd kept it all this time, unable to throw away the last thing he'd touched. Now she read it properly, absorbing news that was already history. North Africa, Burma, the Eastern Front. The war that had taken her father was taking millions more, and would take millions still before it ended. But it would end. That was the thing about wars. They always did, eventually. And when this one ended, there would still be harbors and boats and people who needed bread. There would still be sunrise over the channel, and the smell of salt water and the sound of waves against stone. The world would continue, and she would continue with it. That night, she dreamed of her father for the first time without terror. In the dream, he was standing at the helm of the Mary Catherine, and she was a little girl again, watching him work. He looked over his shoulder at her and smiled, and then he turned back to the sea, his hands steady on the wheel, navigating toward a horizon she couldn't see. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears, but they were different tears, softer, more like rain than storm. She lay in the darkness and whispered into the silence, "I love you. I'll always love you, but I have to let you go now." The harbor stayed empty of her father's boat. That would never change, but Margaret filled it with something else, with memory that honored instead of paralyzed, with grief that deepened rather than destroyed, with love that persisted even in absence. She learned what everyone who survives loss must eventually learn, that the people we love don't require our permanent vigil to remain real. They live in how we carry them forward, in our courage, our kindness, our choice to keep living even when living is hard. The war ended, as wars do. Victory came at a cost too high to calculate. The Mary Catherine was never recovered. William Ashford's name was added to the memorial in Dover, one among thousands who gave their lives defending a small island against a tide of darkness. And every morning, Margaret Ashford woke and went about her life. She married eventually, had children who never knew their grandfather except through stories. She grew old in the house by the harbor, and on quiet mornings, she would walk down to the water's edge and watch the fishing fleet depart. She never stopped watching entirely, but she learned that watching and waiting were different things, and that love didn't require the death of hope. The harbor stayed empty of the ships that didn't return, but it was never truly empty. It held memory and loss and the slow, painful grace of healing. It held the courage of those who kept sailing even after the mines had taken their friends. It held the resilience of a town that buried its dead and then got up the next morning and made bread. And sometimes, in the right light, if you knew how to look, it held ghosts, not haunting, but present, reminding us that those who are gone are never truly gone as long as someone remembers them, as long as someone chooses, every day, to carry them forward into the light. If this story touched your heart, If you felt Margaret's grief and witnessed her journey toward healing, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever waited for someone who couldn't return? How did you learn to move forward while still holding on to love? Your story matters, and this community is here to listen. And if stories like this one resonate with you, stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with quiet courage, please subscribe. There are so many more untold stories from history's shadows waiting to be shared. Let's remember them together.